The Gilded Cage. The rain had been falling all day in Manhattan, a steady silver curtain that blurred the towers of steel and glass into shadowy outlines against the evening sky. Limousines slid up to the entrance of the Orem, the city's most exclusive restaurant, where velvet rope separated the privileged from the merely wealthy, and where even whispers seemed polished before they left one's lips. Within its towering glass walls, chandeliers shimmered like captured constellations, golden light reflecting against crystal glasses and silk gowns. The air itself seemed perfumed with wealth, as though the very oxygen carried a price tag. It was the kind of place where fortunes were casually discussed between sips of wine, and where names were worth more than the food on the gilded plates. At a corner table, angled perfectly against the floor-to-ceiling windows that framed Central Park glittering with street lamps below, sat Jonathan Hale. To most of Manhattan's elite, his name was spoken with a mixture of reverence and fear. A self-made billionaire, founder of Hale Global Enterprises, he had clawed his way from obscurity to build an empire that stretched across industries. His reputation was ironclad, decisive, cold, unrelenting in the boardroom. But here, in the soft glow of the restaurant, none of that armor seemed to matter. Tonight, Jonathan was not the titan of finance, not the man who could bend governments with a phone call. Tonight, he was simply a father sitting beside his son, trying desperately to hold together the fragile pieces of a family life that had fractured 2 years ago. Lucas Hale, 10 years old, sat quietly at his father's side. His hair, chestnut brown, and tousled in a way that spoke more of neglect than fashion, fell across his forehead as he stared at the gleaming silver cutlery arranged before him. He didn't touch the amuse-bouche placed delicately on his plate. His eyes, large, intelligent, but carrying a depth of sadness unusual for a child his age, shifted not to the food, but to the polished wooden dance floor at the center of the room. Musicians played softly, a trio of strings weaving melodies that seemed to glide through the air like silk. Couples in designer gowns and tailored suits moved with effortless grace, their laughter echoing faintly as they turned and twirled. Lucas's legs, bound by metal braces from knee to ankle, rested stiffly against the chair legs. The accident that had stolen his ability to walk freely still haunted every moment of his life. Before that day, he had been a boy of boundless energy, the kind who climbed trees, raced through fields, and danced clumsily with his mother in the living room, to songs that spilled from the radio. But fate had rewritten his story in a cruel twist, and now each step was a battle fought with steel and pain. More than the physical limits, though, it was the isolation that hurt most. His classmates had stopped inviting him to games. Birthday parties came and went without an invitation. Even in public spaces like this, he felt reduced to something fragile, something pitied, something less than whole. Jonathan had brought him here tonight against his own instincts. For months, he had avoided appearing with Lucas in public, not out of shame, but out of a desperate need to shield his son from the stares, the pitying looks, the whispered comments, the cruel curiosity of those who thrived on others' weaknesses. But Jonathan had also realized that his protective silence had built walls around them both. Lucas was withdrawing further into himself, his laughter rare, his eyes always turned downward. Perhaps, Jonathan had reasoned, stepping into the lion's den of high society would force him out of hiding. Or perhaps it was Jonathan himself who needed to be tested, to confront his own helplessness as a father. Servers moved gracefully between tables, their uniforms crisp, their hands steady as they carried trays laden with dishes that looked more like sculptures than meals. Among them was Maya Johnson, the only black waitress in the entire establishment. While the others moved with a studied aloofness, Maya carried herself with quiet determination, each step purposeful, each movement executed with precision. She had learned long ago how to become invisible in rooms like this, how to bow her head just enough, how to keep her voice soft, how to appear indispensable without ever becoming noticed. It was survival, plain and simple. And yet, there was something different in her eyes, a gentleness that seemed out of place in this temple of cold luxury. Lucas noticed her before anyone else did. While most diners barely spared her a glance, he tracked her movements with a kind of longing he couldn't name. Unlike the polished faces that looked past him as though he were an inconvenient detail, Maya's gaze lingered when it met his. For the briefest of moments, their eyes connected, and Lucas felt something he hadn't felt in months. Seen. She smiled. Not the practiced, polite smile of a server, but a small, genuine curve of the lips that acknowledged him as more than a shadow at his father's side. The orchestra shifted its tune, sliding into a gentle waltz. Couples began to rise from their tables, drawn to the dance floor like moths to light. Lucas's heart thumped against his ribs. Memories of his mother swirled in his mind. Her laughter, the way she had held his hands and let him step clumsily, on her feet, guiding him through their own private dances. The ache of her absence felt unbearable. And then, almost without realizing it, he spoke. "Miss, would you dance with me?" The words left his mouth trembling, barely louder than a whisper, but in the hushed elegance of the dining room they carried. Conversations faltered, laughter dimmed, the clink of silver against porcelain stilled. Heads turned toward table 7, where a boy with braces stretched out his hand toward the black waitress who had just set down a tray. Jonathan froze, his fork suspended in midair. A flush of dread washed over him. Around them, whispers began to ripple like waves. Disapproval. Shock, disdain. It was not just the audacity of a child breaking the unspoken decorum, but the fact that the request had been made to her, a server, a woman the upper crust dismissed as little more than a fixture in the room. The restaurant's manager, Richard Collingsworth, moved swiftly through the aisles, his sharp features drawn tight, his posture radiating authority. For over a decade he had ruled the Orem with an iron fist, ensuring that nothing, absolutely nothing, disrupted its cultivated image of perfection. He stopped beside Jonathan's table, his voice smooth but edged with steel. "Mr. Hale, please, control your son. This is not the place for improvisation. Our staff are here to serve, not to entertain." The reprimand cut through Jonathan like a blade. He had faced boardrooms filled with rivals, governments that tried to corner him, billion-dollar crises that demanded ruthless decisions. But nothing had made him feel so small as the eyes of the wealthy, now watching, waiting for his response. "Lucas," Jonathan began, his voice trembling despite himself. "Please, let's not cause a scene. Sit down, son." But Lucas didn't move. His small hand remained outstretched, his eyes fixed on Maya. It wasn't defiance. It was hope. Hope that for just one moment he might belong to this world of glitter and grace. Hope that he could touch the memory of his mother through the simple act of a dance. Maya felt the weight of every gaze upon her. She could hear the faint hiss of whispered judgment from nearby tables, the unspoken threat in Collingsworth's eyes. She knew exactly what was at stake. Her job, her reputation, the fragile stability she had carved out of years of struggle. And yet as she looked into Lucas's pleading face, she felt the walls of fear begin to crumble. For too long she had lived in silence, in compliance, in invisibility. But sometimes one small act could fracture the hardest stone. She inhaled, slowly, the decision crystallizing within her. Maya slipped off her apron, folding it neatly and setting it on the table. The sound was soft, but in the frozen hush of the room it might as well have been thunder. She straightened her back, lifted her chin, and reached for Lucas's hand. "If you'll allow me," she said gently. The entire restaurant seemed to exhale at once. Gasps, murmurs, the rustle of disapproving garments. Collingsworth's jaw tightened until the muscles in his neck stood out like cords. Jonathan's heart pounded, torn between fear of scandal and the sight of his son's eyes, lighting up for the first time in years. Together, Maya and Lucas rose. The boy's braces scraped softly against the polished floor, each sound a defiant drumbeat against the silence of privilege. Step by step, she guided him toward the dance floor, her movements unhurried, her gaze steady. Around them, the glittering crowd parted as though witnessing something forbidden, something dangerous. But to Lucas, it was everything. For the first time since the accident, he wasn't a boy in braces. He was simply a boy, leading a dance with a partner who believed in him. His smile, tentative but radiant, glowed brighter than any chandelier above. And as Jonathan watched, frozen, trembling, utterly undone, he realized that something profound had just shifted. The world as he knew it had begun to crack open. The step that shook the room. The dining hall of the Orem seemed to shrink the moment Maya Johnson placed her hand into Lucas's small, trembling fingers. The chandeliers above, once dazzling in their brilliance, felt like interrogation lamps, casting harsh light onto their fragile rebellion. The music, though unchanged, now carried a weight that pressed into every heart, each note stretched taut by the silence that gripped the patrons. The dance floor, normally a stage for effortless perfection, had become something else entirely. A battlefield where one boy in braces and one waitress of quiet dignity stood against an entire world of unspoken rules. Lucas moved cautiously, every shift of his legs announced by the metallic scrape of his braces against the polished wood. The sound was raw, jarring, even vulgar to ears accustomed to only the smooth swish of silk gowns and the gliding of leather shoes. Yet in that harsh sound there was something undeniable: truth. It was not the performance of privilege, but the raw courage of a child refusing to be invisible. Maya matched her steps to his, never pulling him forward, never masking his effort. Her grace was not in erasing his struggle, but in amplifying his bravery, letting him lead at his own fragile pace. She bent slightly, her eyes meeting his, and smiled with a quiet reassurance that steadied his shaking limbs. Around them, a ripple of whispers began to rise. At one table, a woman in a diamond necklace leaned toward her husband, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "This is appalling. What on earth is Collingsworth allowing?" Another guest, a portly man with a red flush across his cheeks, muttered, "This is not charity, it's indecency paraded before us." The words traveled quickly, carried on the current of scandal that now flooded the hall. Yet among the younger diners there were other murmurs, softer, hesitant, even admiring. "Did you see her? She just risked everything for him. That boy, he looks happy. When was the last time we saw real joy in this place?" Richard Collingsworth stood rigid at the edge of the dance floor, his face an iron mask barely containing his fury. For a decade he had kept the Orem untarnished, a sanctuary of order and perfection, a cathedral where wealth could worship itself without interruption. And now, in one reckless moment, a waitress had shattered his temple of control. He wanted to storm forward, to seize her arm, to drag her back into her place, to restore the hierarchy with the sharp edge of authority. But he hesitated, not out of mercy, but out of fear. For seated at table 7, watching with a mix of horror and awe, was Jonathan Hale, a man whose power did not end with money, but extended into politics, media, and influence. To humiliate Hale's son openly would be to court disaster. Jonathan himself sat frozen, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. At first his instinct had been to stop it, protect Lucas from ridicule, protect himself from scandal, protect the fragile walls of control he had built around them since the accident. But as he watched his son's face, something shifted. Lucas's lips, so often pressed into a thin line of silence, curved now into the faintest of smiles. His eyes, once dulled by resignation, shone with the light of determination. Jonathan saw in those eyes not weakness but the spark of the boy he had thought lost forever. And beside him, Maya's steady presence, her unflinching grace, reflected something Jonathan had not seen in years: the courage his late wife Evelyn had once carried into every room. The music swelled, violins tracing arcs of sound as if in defiance of the oppressive silence around them. Lucas raised his chin, trying to mimic the posture of the men he saw leading their partners across the floor. His steps were uneven, awkward, and halting, but they were his. Each movement was a declaration. I am not broken. I am not invisible. And with every step, Maya honored that declaration, bowing slightly as though she were the one privileged to follow his lead. The room could not look away. Some watched with disdain, others with reluctant fascination, still others with a stirring they could not quite name. It was as though the boy and the waitress had cracked open a hidden door in the heart of the evening, and through it spilled something unwelcome, yet irresistible: truth, raw and unpolished. Then, from the far corner, a voice rang out, low, sardonic, dripping with contempt. What a pathetic spectacle. A tall man in a navy suit, one of Jonathan's longtime rivals in finance, leaned back in his chair, his smirk spreading like oil across the surface of water. Is this what the mighty Jonathan Hale has come to? Letting his crippled son dance with the help? Laughter, cruel and sharp, flickered from his table, though it died quickly when Jonathan's head turned, his gaze a blade of steel. Jonathan's fist clenched under the table, his nails digging into his palms. The insult burned, not just because of its cruelty toward Lucas, but because it forced him to confront the unspoken truth. This was the fear that had chained him for 2 years. The fear that society would see his son as less, that his own power could not shield them from pity and mockery. He had chosen silence, isolation, and control, thinking it was protection. But as he watched Lucas take another trembling step, as he saw Maya bow her head in quiet respect, Jonathan felt a tide rising within him. Perhaps silence was the true betrayal. Collingsworth, seizing the moment, strode onto the floor. His voice was calm, measured, but sharp enough to slice through the music. Miss Johnson, you will return to your duties immediately. This display ends now. His words carried the weight of finality, a public declaration meant to crush rebellion and restore order. Maya felt the command press against her like chains. Years of training, years of survival, years of swallowing her pride screamed at her to obey, to apologize, to retreat. But then she felt Lucas's hand tighten in hers, the boy's knuckles white with determination. She looked down and saw his lips parted, his breath ragged, his eyes pleading, not for pity but for the chance to finish what he had begun. And in that instant, Maya made her choice. She lifted her head and met Collingsworth's gaze directly. I'm afraid I can't do that, sir, she said softly, her voice carrying not defiance but unwavering calm. The silence that followed was electric, every ear straining to catch her words. I promised him this dance, and I intend to keep my promise. A gasp rippled through the crowd. No one had ever spoken back to Collingsworth in this place. His face flushed, his jaw locking so tight it seemed he might shatter his own teeth. You are finished here, he spat, his voice low, trembling with rage. You'll never work in this city again. But Maya did not flinch. She turned back to Lucas, her smile gentle, her voice low enough for him alone. Shall we continue? And they did. Step by halting step, scrape by scrape, they moved across the floor. The music carried them, not as intruders but as pioneers, carving a new rhythm into a place that had long worshipped only perfection. Lucas's face glowed with effort, sweat beating at his temples, but his smile grew broader with each step, and when the final note of the waltz rang out, echoing like a bell across the stunned hall, Maya bowed deeply to him, her voice trembling with sincerity. Thank you for leading me, young sir. It was an honor. The room was silent. No applause, no laughter, only silence thick with shock, confusion, and something else, something dangerous. For in that silence, the unspoken order of privilege had been broken, if only for a moment. Jonathan rose slowly from his seat. His chair scraped against the marble floor, the sound slicing through the tension like a blade. All eyes turned to him. For years, he had been the embodiment of control, of power untouched by sentiment. But now, as he stood watching his son and the waitress who had risked everything, he felt the weight of choice pressing upon him. He could restore the old order with a single word, banish the disruption, retreat into the safety of silence, or he could step forward into the storm, not as the untouchable billionaire, but as a father who had just seen his son come alive again. And for the first time in years, Jonathan did not know what he would choose. A father's awakening. The city was still wrapped in morning haze when Jonathan Hale stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse. From this height, Manhattan stretched out like a living tapestry, avenues pulsing with traffic, rivers glinting like steel under the pale sun, towers competing for dominance. Normally, he would have welcomed the view with the satisfaction of a conqueror surveying his domain, but today, none of it touched him. His reflection in the glass, looked older, wearier than he had allowed himself to admit. The face of a man who had everything and yet felt himself slipping into an abyss he could not control. He thought of the night before, of the whispers, the stares, the humiliation he had feared for years. And yet, when he closed his eyes, the image that returned was not the smirks of rivals or the fury of Collingsworth. It was his son's smile, trembling but radiant, as he took halting steps across the floor. That smile had been worth every scandal. Still, Jonathan's mind gnawed at him. What came next? Society would not forget. The newspapers might not report on the private spectacle of a restaurant, but the city's rumor mill was relentless, and the elite circles in which he moved thrived on scandal like vultures on carrion. His rivals would whisper that Jonathan Hale had lost his grip, that the once ruthless titan had grown soft, sentimental, distracted. Investors could grow uneasy. Boards could waver. Power was as fragile as reputation, and Jonathan knew too well how quickly both could slip. Yet beneath the fear was something else, something heavier, more intimate. For the first time in years, Jonathan wondered if the walls he had built around himself and Lucas had been less a fortress and more a prison. At the breakfast table, Lucas ate quietly, his movements slow, deliberate. The boy said little, but Jonathan caught the glint in his eyes, a brightness that had been absent for so long. When Lucas finally looked up, there was no hesitation, no mask of submission. "Dad," he said softly, "did you see? I led her. I really led." His voice wavered with pride and disbelief, and Jonathan felt something twist painfully in his chest. "Yes," Jonathan answered, his throat tight. "I saw." It was in that moment he knew what he had to do. He could not allow last night to be reduced to gossip, to whispers of impropriety. He could not let Maya Johnson's courage be punished into silence. For Lucas's sake, for his own, for the ghost of Evelyn who would never forgive him for choosing cowardice, he would act. He would bring her into his world no matter how reckless, no matter how many disapproved. By mid-morning, Maya Johnson stood in the lobby of Carter Tower, though her hands trembled as she gripped the strap of her worn tote bag. The skyscraper loomed over Wall Street like a monument to power, its glass facade gleaming with authority. She had barely slept, her mind replaying the events of the previous night. Every rational thought screamed at her to forget it, to disappear into the anonymity of survival. But then Jonathan's voice had cut through the stunned silence of the Orem, asking her name, pressing his gilded business card into her palm. 10 a.m., Carter Tower. It had not been a request. It had been a command, wrapped in unexpected respect. The lobby was a different universe than the restaurant. Where the Orem was gilded opulence, Carter Tower was cold efficiency. Marble floors, reflected streams of early light. Men in tailored suits strode briskly, clutching tablets and speaking into headsets. Women in sharp dresses typed furiously at sleek reception counters. The air buzzed with urgency and precision. Maya's clearance rack navy dress and scuffed flats marked her instantly as an outsider, and she felt the weight of 100 curious eyes pressing against her back. At the reception desk, she announced herself in a voice that was steady, despite her nerves. "Maya Johnson, I have an appointment with Mr. Hale." The receptionist blinked, her brows arching almost imperceptibly, then pressed a button on her headset. "Miss Winters will escort you," she said curtly. Moments later, a tall woman in her early 40s approached, every line of her gray suit sharp as a blade. Linda Winters, Jonathan's chief of staff, was known in corporate circles as his shadow, a woman of iron composure and ruthless efficiency. She stopped in front of Maya, her eyes sweeping her up and down with cool detachment. "So, you're Maya Johnson," she said, her tone laced with irony. "My boss usually summons executives to this floor, not waitresses. You must have made quite an impression." The word stung, but Maya forced herself to meet Linda's gaze with calm dignity. "Perhaps I did," she replied softly. Linda's eyes narrowed as if unused to being challenged even so gently. Without another word, she turned on her heel. "Follow me." The elevator ride to the 18th floor was silent, the kind of silence weighted with unspoken judgment. Maya held herself upright, refusing to shrink, even as Linda's presence pressed against her like cold steel. When the doors slid open, the hallway before them was lined with walnut floors, abstract art on the walls, and offices bathed in natural light. Staff paused to glance at Maya, some with curiosity, others with outright disdain. She knew what they saw, a server from a restaurant daring to step into the sanctum of wealth. But she walked steadily, each step echoing louder than it should have. Linda stopped at a conference room and gestured stiffly. "Wait here. Mr. Hale will see you when he is free." She closed the door behind Maya with a finality that felt like a challenge. Alone, Maya stood in the quiet room, her heart pounding. She could have fled. She could have walked out of the tower, disappeared into the city, pretended last night had never happened. But something stronger held her in place. The memory of Lucas's hand clutching hers, of his trembling voice asking for a dance, of the pride in his eyes when he said he had led. If that boy had found the courage to stand before a room of merciless elites, then she could stand here no matter how unwelcome. When the door finally opened, Jonathan Hale entered. He was not the titan from magazine covers, not the aloof billionaire feared in boardrooms. He looked tired, his tie loosened, his eyes shadowed by restless thought. Yet his presence filled the room with the weight of authority. He studied Maya, in silence for a long moment before speaking. "Miss Johnson," he said finally, his voice low, steady. "Thank you for what you did last night." Maya blinked, startled. She had expected anger, accusation, perhaps even dismissal. Gratitude was the last thing she had prepared for. "I didn't do it for thanks, Mr. Hale," she replied carefully. "I did it because he asked, and because he deserved one dance." Jonathan's lips pressed into a thin line. "And in doing so, you risked your job, your reputation, perhaps more. You stood against Collingsworth, against the entire room. Why?" Maya hesitated, then lifted her chin. "Because I know what it means to be invisible, to be told your place, to be told, you don't belong. I saw that same look in your son's eyes and I couldn't let it stand, not when he asked with so much hope." Jonathan's chest tightened. He thought of Lucas's face, of Evelyn's voice reminding him that connection mattered more than perfection. He thought of his own cowardice, his own silence. "You were braver than I was," he admitted quietly. The word surprised even him. He was not a man who confessed weakness, not in boardrooms, not in private. Yet they spilled out with an honesty he could not restrain. For the first time he realized how deeply he had failed, not in protecting Lucas from stairs, but in robbing him of chances to live. "I want you to work with him," Jonathan said suddenly. Maya frowned, uncertain she had heard correctly. "Work with Lucas?" "Yes," Jonathan said firmly, though his voice carried the weight of uncertainty. "I don't know what your title will be. I don't know how it will look. But I know that last night you gave him something I haven't been able to in 2 years. You gave him joy, you gave him confidence. I want you to help him find more of that, to help him live again." Maya's heart pounded. This was madness. She was a waitress. She had no training, no credentials, nothing that would justify stepping into the life of one of the most powerful families in the city. Yet when she thought of Lucas's smile, she felt the pull of something greater than fear. "I'll do it," she said softly, "if that's what he wants." Jonathan nodded, a flicker of relief passing over his stern features. Then it settled. Outside the conference room, Linda Winters stiffened as she overheard fragments of the conversation. Her jaw clenched, her hands curling into fists. To her, this was a disaster, an interloper threatening the delicate machinery of Jonathan's empire. She vowed silently that this would not stand. Inside, however, a fragile alliance had been forged. A billionaire weighed down by guilt, a waitress carrying the scars of invisibility, and a boy yearning for life. For the first time, Jonathan felt the stirrings of something he had long buried: hope. And as Maya left the tower, her head held high despite the stares that followed her, Jonathan turned to the window once more. The city pulsed below, relentless, judgmental, unforgiving. But for the first time, Jonathan wondered if he might be strong enough not to conquer it, but to change it, starting not with power, but with his son. The awakening had begun. Rebuilding through small steps. The first morning Maya walked into the Hale residence, she felt as though she had stepped into a museum of silence. The house, if such a word could even be applied to something so vast, rose on the Upper East Side, like a fortress of wealth, with marble steps that gleamed under the sun and tall windows that caught the light like polished eyes. Inside, the space was immaculate to the point of sterility. The high ceilings bore chandeliers of imported crystal, the walls displayed art worth millions, and the floors were polished so precisely that Maya could see her own reflection looking back at her. But despite the grandeur, the place felt empty, as if every polished surface were trying too hard to disguise the absence that lingered in the air. It was the kind of house where everything was in order, but nothing felt alive. Lucas was waiting for her in the sunroom, his wheelchair angled toward the window overlooking the city skyline. He didn't speak when she entered. He merely turned his face slightly, acknowledging her with those same intelligent, wounded eyes she had seen at the restaurant. His braces were strapped neatly, as though arranged by habit rather than choice. His hands fiddled with the armrest, restless but restrained, like a boy who wanted to move but no longer trusted his body to obey. Jonathan was there too, standing in the doorway like a sentinel. His suit was as sharp as ever, but his expression was unreadable. He gave Maya the briefest of nods, the kind a man gave when he was unsure of what he had invited into his home. "He's yours for the morning," Jonathan said quietly. "I'll be in my office." And with that he left, retreating down the hall, leaving behind the faint echo of shoes on marble and the heavy silence of expectation. Maya approached Lucas, slowly, not with the briskness of a professional, but with the gentle patience of someone who had lived on the margins long enough to understand the fragility of pride. She did not launch into instructions or cheerful chatter. Instead, she simply pulled a chair close to him and sat down. For several minutes, they said nothing. The world outside the glass buzzed with traffic and horns, but in the sunroom, time seemed suspended. Finally, Maya broke the silence. "You were brave the other night," she said softly. "Braver than anyone else in that room." Lucas's eyes flicked toward her, suspicion and curiosity warring in his gaze. "I wasn't brave," he muttered. "I just wanted to dance." Maya smiled gently. Sometimes wanting something enough, to ask for it in front of people who don't understand, is the bravest thing you can do. He didn't respond right away, but his fingers stopped fidgeting. That tiny stillness told her more than words could. The first few days were tentative. Maya didn't try to transform him overnight. Instead, she started with small rituals. She brought music into the sunroom, not the formal string quartets the house occasionally echoed with, but softer tunes, ones with rhythms that could seep into the bones. She encouraged Lucas to tap his fingers along, to hum if he wanted, to let the sound remind him that life was still moving, even when his legs refused. At first he resisted, offering only half-hearted taps or sighs of impatience. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the boy began to let the music reach him. One afternoon, when the rain lashed against the glass, Maya stood up and offered him her hand. "Just one step," she said. "Not a dance, not a performance. Just one step with me." Lucas hesitated, his jaw tightening, the old fear rising like a wall. But then, remembering the night at the Orem, he reached out, his small hand trembling in hers. Together, they rose. His braces clanged awkwardly against the floor, his balance shaky, his breath caught. But Maya did not rush him. She matched, her movements to his halting rhythm, steadying him when he faltered, praising him when he managed even the smallest motion. When he collapsed back into the chair, panting, sweat on his forehead, she simply smiled and said, "That was perfect." And for the first time since his accident, Lucas laughed, a sound rusty from disuse but full of warmth. Jonathan watched these moments from a distance. At first, he had instructed himself not to interfere, to let Maya do whatever strange magic she seemed to have. But he found himself lingering in doorways, half hidden behind pillars, his heart caught in his throat as he listened to his son's laughter. It was a sound he had almost forgotten, a sound Evelyn had once promised would always fill their home, and now, brought back by a woman society would have dismissed as invisible, it cut through his carefully constructed walls like sunlight through cracks in stone. But outside the house, the world was less forgiving. Within days, whispers began circulating in Jonathan's circles. At private clubs, at shareholder meetings, at social dinners, people raised eyebrows at the rumor that Jonathan Hale had hired a waitress, a black waitress no less, into his household. They questioned his judgment, his stability, even his loyalty to the circles that had made him. Some of his oldest associates asked pointed questions. Is this wise, Jonathan? You're letting sentiment cloud your decisions. What will the board think if they see you surrounding yourself with outsiders? Behind the thin veil of concern was the sharp edge of prejudice, the same prejudice Maya had faced all her life. Linda Winters, ever watchful, seized upon this discontent. In quiet conversations with influential partners, she painted Maya as a distraction, a destabilizing presence. She whispered that Jonathan was losing his edge, that his grief and his guilt had made him reckless. She told them that the empire they depended on was at risk of being steered by sentiment rather than strategy. And the more she spoke, the more the whispers grew. Maya, though unaware of the full extent of this brewing storm, felt the undercurrents in every glance cast her way when she accompanied Lucas outside. At the park, mothers pulled their children slightly closer. At cafes, businessmen whispered behind menus. On the rare occasions Jonathan joined them, the judgment in others' eyes grew sharper, as though even his presence could not protect her from the weight of their disdain. But Maya refused to bow to it. Every step with Lucas, every halting laugh, every scrap of progress was worth more than their approval. One evening, as twilight painted the city in hues of gold and violet, Jonathan sat across from Maya in the sunroom while Lucas slept on the couch, exhausted from their practice. He studied her in the dim light, his voice low, hesitant. "They don't understand," he said. "They'll never understand what you're giving him." Maya met his gaze steadily. "I don't care if they understand. I'm not here for them. I'm here for him." Jonathan leaned back, exhaling slowly. For a man accustomed to commanding nations of numbers, he found himself adrift in unfamiliar waters. He realized then that Maya was not merely teaching his son to move again. She was teaching him, Jonathan, the meaning of courage stripped of wealth, of dignity stripped of status. She was teaching him to see not with fear of judgment, but with the clarity of love. The rebuilding had begun, not with grand gestures, but with small steps. A tap of fingers against the table, a halting shuffle across the floor, a shared laugh after years of silence. And though the city beyond their windows bristled with scorn and doubt, within those walls something stronger than reputation was taking root. For the first time since Evelyn's death, Jonathan Hale allowed himself to hope, not for control, not for power, but for life. The dance of change. The night of the charity gala arrived with the kind of expectation that made the city's elite dress not just in gowns and tuxedos, but in invisible armor of status. The ballroom of the Metropolitan Hotel glowed under hundreds of crystal chandeliers, each one scattering light across marble floors polished to a mirror's sheen. The tables were adorned with centerpieces of white orchids and gold candelabras, and the air was thick with the scent of wealth, the musk of power and the perfume of influence. Conversations hummed like electricity, punctuated by laughter that sounded more rehearsed than spontaneous. Here, reputations were displayed like trophies, and weakness was forbidden currency. Jonathan Hale's arrival was met with the kind of attention reserved for royalty. The crowd turned, whispers rising like a tide. The formidable billionaire, the widower, the man whose empire seemed untouchable. But tonight, all eyes widened for another reason. For at his side was Maya Johnson, dressed simply in a navy gown, that had no designer's label but carried the dignity of authenticity. And between them was Lucas, in his braces and tailored jacket, his face set with a determination that outshone the discomfort of every step. Together, the three of them walked into the ballroom, and in their wake followed silence, a silence more piercing than any applause. The whispers began almost instantly. Is that her? The waitress? Has he lost his mind? This will ruin him. From one corner, a socialite in diamonds smirked and murmured to her companion, "How touching. A billionaire playing savior. Let's see how long this one lasts." But amid the disdain were others who watched with curiosity, with something almost like admiration. The sight of Jonathan Hale, unflinching as he escorted a woman of no pedigree and a boy of fragile steps into the heart of society's judgment, unsettled the balance of the evening. The gala unfolded with its usual rhythm: auctioned art pieces, orchestrated speeches, champagne toasts. But beneath the polished surface, tension simmered. Jonathan could feel the eyes on him, measuring, doubting, waiting for him to falter. He had lived his life mastering those gazes, turning them into weapons he wielded with precision. Tonight, however, he refused to play by those rules. His focus was on Lucas, who sat quietly at their table, his gaze drifting to the grand dance floor where couples swayed effortlessly to the music. When the orchestra shifted into a slow waltz, Lucas turned to Maya. His voice was low, but steady. "Will you dance with me again?" The question echoed the one he had asked weeks before in the gilded prison of the Aurum. But here, in this grander hall, the stakes were immeasurably higher. Maya's hand tightened gently over his. She looked into his eyes, reading the determination there, and then nodded. "Of course," she whispered. As she rose and helped Lucas to his feet, the ballroom grew quiet. Conversations faltered, laughter dimmed, and every gaze turned toward the unlikely pair. The sound of Lucas's braces against the marble floor carried through the silence, each scrape a defiance against the unspoken rules of the elite. Maya matched her steps to his, her grace flowing around his struggle, amplifying his courage rather than concealing it. Slowly, painstakingly, Lucas began to lead. His movements were clumsy, his balance precarious, but his face was lit with a pride that silenced even the most cynical lips. For Jonathan, watching from their table, time seemed to collapse. He saw not just his son in braces, but the boy Evelyn had once lifted into her arms, the boy who had laughed freely, who had believed he could fly. He saw Maya's quiet strength, her willingness to risk everything for dignity and joy. And he saw himself, not the titan of industry, not the billionaire obsessed with control, but a father who had nearly lost his son to silence and fear. Something within him broke free, something that had been shackled by grief and pride for too long. Jonathan rose. The scrape of his chair against the floor cut through the music, drawing even sharper stares. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped onto the dance floor. The crowd gasped, some in shock, others in anticipation of scandal. He approached Maya and Lucas, and for a moment, father and son simply looked at one another. Lucas's eyes widened, disbelief etched across his face. Jonathan extended his hand. "May I join you?" he asked softly. Lucas's lips trembled into a smile, and he nodded. Together, the three of them formed a circle, father, son, and waitress, moving slowly to the music. It was awkward, imperfect, even ungainly, but it was real, and in that imperfection lay a beauty more powerful than the choreographed elegance surrounding them. The ballroom erupted in whispers, some horrified, some awestruck. A few began to clap, hesitantly at first, then with growing force, until the sound rose like a wave. The applause was not unanimous, many still sat frozen in disdain, but it was enough to shift the balance. For the first time, Jonathan realized he did not care about their approval. He cared only for the boy whose eyes now gleamed with joy, and the woman who had taught them both what courage truly meant. When the music ended, Jonathan did something no one had expected. He turned to the microphone at the edge of the stage. Taking it in his hand, He looked out over the sea of glittering faces, their expressions ranging from shock to admiration to contempt. His voice, when it came, was calm but resonant, carrying the weight of truth. 2 years ago, I lost my wife, and with her I thought I had lost my son. I built walls around him, around myself, around our lives. I told myself I was protecting him, but in truth I was hiding. I was afraid of your judgment, of your whispers, of the way this world treats anyone who is different. And in that fear, I nearly lost him again, not to an accident, but to silence. Last night, a boy asked for a dance, and a woman had the courage to give it to him, even when every rule told her not to. In that moment, she gave my son something I could not. His voice, his dignity, his joy. The room was utterly still, every ear straining to catch each word. Jonathan's eyes swept over them, unflinching. If that offends you, if it makes you question my judgment, so be it. I no longer measure myself by your approval. I measure myself by the smile on my son's face, and by the courage of those who remind me what it means to be human. He turned to Maya and Lucas, his expression softening. Tonight my son led a dance, and I followed. From now on, that is the only kind of leadership I care about. For a moment, the ballroom was silent. Then slowly, applause began to rise, again, not polite, not forced, but genuine. It grew louder, swelling into a standing ovation that filled the space like thunder. Even those who disapproved found themselves swept into the tide, compelled by the undeniable force of truth. Maya felt tears sting her eyes, but she held her head high, her hand still firmly clasping Lucas's. The boy beamed, his chest rising, with pride, his laughter ringing out like music of its own. And Jonathan, standing beside them, felt something he had not felt in years. Freedom. Not the freedom of power or wealth, but the freedom of authenticity, of living unchained by fear of judgment. That night marked a turning point, not just for the Hale family, but for every person in that room who witnessed it. Whispers of scandal became stories of inspiration. Rivals who had mocked found themselves silenced. And though prejudice and doubt did not vanish, something stronger had been planted in their place. The undeniable memory of a boy in braces leading a dance, a waitress who dared to stand tall, and a billionaire who chose love over fear. In the days that followed, Jonathan's empire did not crumble. Instead, it began to transform. Investors who had doubted him found themselves inspired by his candor. Boards that had bristled at his choices discovered a new kind of loyalty in his vision. And through it all, Maya remained. Not as a server, not as an outsider, but as a guide, a friend, and a reminder that dignity and courage could change even the coldest of worlds. As for Lucas, each day he grew stronger, not just in body, but in spirit. The braces were still there, the struggle still real, but his laughter returned, his will rekindled. He no longer hid from the world. He led it, one halting step at a time. And so, in a city that measured worth in numbers and status, one dance rewrote the rules. It proved that change does not always roar from boardrooms or echo from towers. Sometimes it begins with a boy who dares to ask, a woman who dares to say yes, and a father who dares to awaken. For Jonathan Hale, Maya Johnson, and Lucas, that night was not an ending. It was the beginning of a new rhythm, a rhythm born not of perfection, but of connection. And as they stepped into that future together, the world could only watch and learn to follow.